The Notebook of Doom. Flurry of the SNOMBIES. Chapter 1, First Day of Bummer. Alexander stepped out of his air-conditioned house and into a volcano. Actually, it wasn't a volcano. It was his front porch. "Shake a leg, kiddo," his dad shouted from the driveway. "Ugh, hi," Alexander groaned. "It's 1,000,000 degrees outside." "You're right," his dad said. "The perfect day to start summer camp." By the time Alexander got to the car, he was drenched with sweat. "A week at Camp Gloy will be super neat," his dad said. He tossed Alexander's sleeping bag into the trunk. "You'll learn great survival skills." Alexander slumped into the back seat. He already had great survival skills. Ever since moving to Sturmont, he had survived being stomped, chomped, and swallowed by all kinds of monsters. He and his two best friends were members of a monster-fighting club called the Super Secret Monster Patrol. SSMP for short. Alexander buckled his seatbelt. "It's just," he said. "I'm not really much of a camper." "Oh, Al," his dad said, turning on the car. "Just give it a shot. I loved summer camp when I was a kid." Alexander sighed. "And don't forget," his dad said. "Rip and Nikki will be there, too." Alexander smiled a little. "This week is going to be hot, stinky, and totally crummy," he thought. "But at least my best friends and I can be hot, stinky, and crummy together." Chapter 2, Uphill Drive. The car began winding its way up into the Gloy Mountains. The town of Sturmont was laid out below like a bunch of dollhouses. Alexander could see the water tower, his crumbling old school, and the brand new school where he'd be going this fall. CRRR Runch. Alexander's dad turned onto a gravel road. Alexander had spent plenty of time in the woods behind his house. But these woods felt wilder. The trees were taller, the hills were steeper, and the shadows seemed darker. Whoosh! Just up the road, something gray and fuzzy darted through the trees. "Holy molars!" Alexander's dad shouted. "Did you see that?" Alexander gasped. He grabbed a book from his backpack, the official SSMP monster notebook. Alexander never left home without it. He flipped it open. Skeeter copters. Two-headed mosquito with spinning blades. Habitat, tents, backyard BBQs, swimming holes. PSHHHT. Skeeter copters, love the smell of bug spray. Diet, human blood. Behavior, these blood-sucking bugs slice through tents to snack on snoozing campers. Warning, if you must go camping, zip yourself all the way up in your sleeping bag. Leave no skin exposed. "That vulture was huge," said Alexander's dad. Alexander snapped the notebook shut. "A plain old bird?" he thought. "That's not even close to a monster." They drove deeper into the forest. The grave road became a dirt road. Then the dirt road became a narrow, weed-covered lane. They came to a stop at a crooked gate. Camp Gloy. Alexander's dad turned off the car. "Well, here we are," he said. They stepped out and looked around. The forest was silent. "Where is everybody?" said Alexander. "Creak! Ugh! Whoosh!" A hairy beast man leaped over the gate, landed with a grunt, and rushed toward Alexander. Chapter 3, Strange Ranger. "Howdy, I'm Ranger Harry," said the man at the gate. He looked like a cross between a bear and a lumberjack. In sandals. "Oh, hi," said Alexander's dad. "Glad to see a friendly face." Ranger Harry knelt down by Alexander. He had a bushy ponytail, a shaggy beard, and the hairiest arms Alexander had ever seen. "You must be Alexander Bopp," he said. "You're the last chipmunk to arrive." Yeah, said Alexander. He couldn't stop staring at the ranger's hairy feet. Even his toes were shaggy. Ranger Harry opened the gate. Say bye to your dad and go on ahead to the campfire circle, he said. Alexander grabbed his things from the car. Happy camping, Al, said his dad, giving him a tight squeeze. See you in a week, Dad, said Alexander. He headed into the woods and stopped when the path forked in different directions. Great, thought Alexander. There's no sign for campfire circle. I've been at camp for 2 minutes, and I'm already lost. Salamander, shouted a voice. Where have you been, Salamander? Shouted another voice. Alexander grinned. Only 2 people called him Salamander, the other 2 members of the SSMP. Rip. Nicky, he shouted. He turned to see his friends running down the trail. They were both soaked with sweat. Instead of her usual hoodie, Nicky wore a floppy yellow sun hat. What a hat, said Alexander. Hat, said Rip. It looks like a glob of pizza dough landed on her head. Nicky rolled her eyes. This big hat keeps me shaded, she said. It works better than sunblock. Nicky was secretly a monster called a jampire. A good monster. Alexander wiped the sweat from his brow. So, guys, he said. Which way should we go? Beats me, said Rip. Ranger Scary sent us out on our own, too. They tried a few trails and finally found the campfire circle. 3 other kids stood near an empty fire pit. Behind the pit was a hill of white grainy stuff that looked like sand. Ranger Harry stood on the hill. Hello, possums, he shouted. Welcome to Camp Gloy. He tugged at his beard. I thought there'd be more of you, he said. Oh, well. Tell us who you are and why you're here. Why did you come to Camp Gloy? To hike, Anna. To swim, Nicky. To relax, Alexander. Not to listen to ghost stories. Seriously, guys, Leo. Mom said I had to, Rip. I like bunnies, Dottie. Get ready for the happiest, campiest week of your lives, said Ranger Harry. But also, get ready to learn how to survive. He slid down the hill, raising a cloud of white dust. The sun's about to set, so let's go to our cabins. Any questions? Alexander raised his hand. Where did that big pile of sand come from? Ranger Harry laughed. This isn't sand, he said. It's salt. Camp Gloy was built on an old salt mine. Miners would dig up salt from inside this mountain. Then they'd ship it to restaurants, road crews, and pretzel factories. Rip wiped his forehead on his sleeve. Are you sure that salt didn't come from dried-up camper sweat? Alexander gave his own shirt a sniff. Ugh, our week at camp is really going to stink. Chapter 4, Cabin Fever. Dibs on the top bunk, said Rip, shoving his way into the boys' cabin. Okay, whatever, said Alexander. There are plenty of beds. We can all have top bunks. He turned to their 3rd roommate. Leo, do you want the bed by the window? No, thanks, said Leo. He pulled out a nightlight. I'll take a spot where I can plug this in. The boys played a few games of check before flopping into bed. The air was heavy, and a dim moonbeam peeked through the window. Ugh, said Rip. It's so hot. I'm baking like, said a potato. I'll open the window more, said Alexander. No, cried Leo. He jerked his blanket over his face. Oh, said Rip. Maybe it's time for a ghost story. Clink! Alexander and Rip looked to the window. Did you hear something? Asked Leo. Clink, clink. Alexander sat up. It's coming from outside, he whispered. Yipes! Leo burrowed further under his covers. Rip stuck his head out the window. "There's nothing there, guys," he said. "Just trees and mountains and junk like that." "I bet it was a raccoon," said Alexander. "That was no raccoon," Leo muttered from his blanket. "It was a ghost." "Oh, come on," said Rip. "Ghosts aren't real." "Now, monsters, on the other hand," added Alexander. "Gaw!" Leo screamed. "Oh, sorry," said Alexander. "Don't be scared, we're totally safe in our cabin." Something pounded at the door. The boys shrieked. "Creak!" Ranger Harry stuck his bushy head in the cabin. "Nighty-night, Badgers," he said. "Cam rule number 44, get a good night's sleep." Slam! The door closed. But the boys' eyes stayed open long into the night. Chapter 5, Rise and Wine. Blarp bla larp blarble blarp. Alexander woke to a buzzy, honking sound coming from outside. "What is that?" he asked. "A bird, maybe," said Leo. Rip yawned. "Or a barfing buffalo. Or a super loud monster," thought Alexander. He threw on some clothes. Then he peeked in the notebook while Rip and Leo were getting dressed. Blue-thorned honkflower. Beautiful plant, ugly sound. Habitat, hiking trails. Doodle-dee-dee. Honkflowers love to clarinet music. Diet, the tears of people who can't stand its terrible noise. Behavior, this plant blows a foghorn sound. When anything touches it. Warning! Watch your step. Avoid touching the ground when hiking. "Let's go see what's making that noise," said Alexander, snapping the notebook shut. The boys stepped out into the hot morning air. Nikki, Anna, and Dottie stood outside the girls' cabin, covering their ears. Ranger Harry marched along, blowing hard into a bugle. His cheeks were almost as red as his beard. "Rise and shine, critters," he said. "It's chow time." The ranger led the campers to a picnic table. "For breakfast," he said, "we're having piping. The hot salt mush. And to wash it down, a steamy mug of onion cider." Alexander sniffed a spoonful of salt mush. Rip pushed his bowl aside. "Yo! Papa Bear," he said. "This porridge is way too hot for this weather." Ranger Harry's eyes narrowed. Camp rule number 81, always eat a hot breakfast. Rip sighed. Alexander turned to Nikki. Her face was hidden by the brim of her floppy hat. "So," he said, "how was your first night in the girls' cabin?" Nikki looked up. Her eyes were half closed. "Lousy," she said. "I didn't get much sleep. I kept hearing this weird sound dash." "A clinking noise," said Alexander. "Yes," said Nikki. "Like someone ringing a glass bell." "Maybe it was a bunny," said Dottie. "Bunnies can't ring bells," said Anna. "Dink! Dink!" Ranger Harry tapped his spoon against his canteen. "Listen up, muskrats. Each of you will learn one survival skill this week." He put a clipboard on the table. "Canoeing?" said Nikki. "Awesome." "Map-making?" said Alexander. "I wish I had gotten archery." "Map-making's better than fire safety," said Rip. "Anything with safety in the name must be boring." The campers lined up in the blistering sun to await orders from Ranger Harry. One by one, he gave them a tool and a set of instructions. "Nikki," he said. "Take this paddle and meet me at Lake Glomy." "Yes, sir," said Nikki, smiling. "Rip," he said. "Take these safety booklets and start reading." Rip groaned. Ranger Harry made his way down the line to Alexander. "Take this paper," pencil, and compass. Your job is to map out our campgrounds, he said. Okay, said Alexander. Ranger Harry lifted his bugle. Blaoa Arp. Now go, he shouted. Meet back here for lunch. The campers scattered. Alexander hiked all over camp, drawing his map. He saw a lookout tower, a rope bridge, and a few more mounds of salt. Not bad, thought Alexander, folding up the map. I hit every spot in camp. Clink, clink. Alexander jumped. The noise from last night. The clinks sounded like ice cubes hitting a glass. They were coming from deep in the woods. Hello, he called out. Is someone there? Splap. Something hit him on the back of his head. Something wet. And cold. Plop. The icy thing fell from his head and splat on the ground. A snowball? Alexander thought. In this heat? He looked around. Nobody was there. Alexander scooped up the lump of snow from the dry, cracked dirt. Then he remembered his first day in